And I've got the pleasure of introducing Sandi. Sandi Caesar. I realized when I was writing this that I've known Sandi longer than there was an internet. So I was telling her, who knew here we'd be 30 something years later on Zoom. And here we are. Sandi was born in Panama and she was placed for adoption without her birth mother's knowledge or consent, and then subsequently was raised in Ohio starting at age 3. Just to put it out there, she's very anxious to meet other adoptees from Panama if you happen to know anybody. Sandi is a social worker. She has an undergraduate degree from Howard University and her M.S.W. from Indiana University. After beginning her career here in Cleveland in 1992 as a case manager at a neighborhood mental health center, Sandi followed her coworker from that agency to Harambe Services for Black Families, which was an adoption agency here in the Cleveland area at that time. I was her supervisor at Harambe who suggested that she get involved with Adoption Network Cleveland. So Sandi was introduced to us as a professional, but remained involved over all these years as an adoptee. And Sandi and I have kept in touch all these years, which has really been great. Sandi worked in adoption for 4 years before becoming a full-time stay-at-home mom with her 2 sons. And then she returned to work outside the home in 2006 in Indiana with the Department of Child Services, the public agency, where she worked for about 12 years, working in foster care licensing and then serving as the state's adoption manager for the last 6 years. In 2020, Sandi moved to Virginia, accepting a position as a supervisor with a foster care agency where she worked for 2 years. And it was in that role that she really began to see the work taking its toll on her and the common practices often conflicting with her own beliefs. So that's what she's going to be talking to us about this evening, and I'll hand it over to Sandi.
Thank you. And let me make sure I'm sharing. Can everybody see that? And only the PowerPoint screen, not like my notes and everything else, right? Yes. Okay. Well, first I want to say thank you. Thank you so much to Betsy for reaching out and asking me if I would present. Thank you to Adoption Network Cleveland for the opportunity, but also for the years and years of support. And thank you all who have shown up tonight. I'm so excited. I see a lot of familiar faces. I'm very honored that you are here, and I definitely appreciate you. So this will be kind of a different presentation for me. I have had quite a few opportunities to share my adoption story. And that's not necessarily what I'm doing tonight. There will be pieces of it throughout tonight's presentation, and it was very well summarized by Betsy in that intro. And certainly when we get to questions, I'm always happy to share parts of my story that may interest someone or may even perhaps support somebody in their own journey. What I'm going to be speaking on tonight will be really my own thoughts and perspectives based on experiences and systems that I have been a part of. It is truly my own beliefs and opinions about things. So you may hear things that maybe you disagree about based on your own experiences. And I think that that's okay. It's certainly okay with me. I hope that that's okay with you. I do feel like conversations and even discomfort sometimes is the place where we grow as individuals. I did want to give a couple of trigger warnings. I will mention suicide, and then anytime you're talking about child welfare, there is, although I really try and stay away from specific kiddos' stories, but there, are opportunities that relinquishment, child abuse, and neglect may come up as well. So I just, with those trigger warnings, just ask that you would take care of yourself. So through the years, presenting my own story and also various different kinds of trainings that I've been able to do, I've always opened with these 2 quotes. I feel like the first one, Marcus Garvey, is pretty self-explanatory. I don't read PowerPoints to people, so I'm not going to do that. If anybody does need me to read anything to them, please let me know. But that first quote by Marcus Garvey, I was really excited when I recently saw it in the opening of Susan Kyo Ito's book, her memoir, I Would Meet You Anywhere. That's a quote that she also included in her book. The second one really speaks to how the more we learn, the more our perspective and understanding of things change. I am always hopeful that whenever I am able to present to an audience, I'm hopeful that at least one person will leave seeing something in a way that maybe they had never considered before. So that is my hope for tonight. Okay, so me. For as long as I can remember, I would say back to 4 years old, possibly earlier than that, all I ever wanted to be was a veterinarian. I was not one of those kids who wanted to be a princess and a doctor and a veterinarian and a queen. I just wanted to be a veterinarian. I had no backup plan. I had no second option. It was all that I ever wanted to be. Unfortunately, when I failed organic chemistry for the second time, I started to realize that that dream probably was not going to happen for me. In hindsight, as an adult, there probably was more effort that I could have put towards that. But at that time, I really gave up on my dreams of becoming a vet. However, I really had no idea what else to do. I ended up earning my Bachelor of Science degree in Human Development with an emphasis on child development, but just no idea what I was going to do with that. I went into it like, okay, this kind of fits who I am, maybe, but I just had no direction. So I really floundered. When I graduated in 91 from Howard, I immediately went into an accelerated nursing program, an accelerated BSN program. I did one semester of that. I applied and was accepted to a Master of Counseling program. I looked into social work programs. I did a little bit of this and that, not knowing, but none of it really felt like, none of it spoke to me. And so I often speak of how coming into different roles and opportunities for me was a God thing. And I see Miss Jennifer Diane Ghostin on here. It was a reference that I made when I shared my story with her. And I really want to clarify that when I say that, it's not that I believe child welfare or even social work is doing God's work. But when I say that, it's because I truly had no direction of my own. And I feel that there was a divine power that was really guiding my steps to positions where I could grow and I could contribute using my own experiences to hopefully make some kind of an impact, even if it was just on one person. And so I think that you'll see that kind of throughout, that I had no idea what I was doing. That's the plain truth of it. So ultimately realizing I had a baby, not realizing I had a baby. Ultimately, with a baby, I realized that I needed to go to work, that I had to do something more than retail and temp work that I had been doing. I started at community guidance. I was about 25 years old. I had no idea what I was doing. I found a job posting and it seemed like my educational background fit the job posting, not that the position fit my goals. I think it's important to know that I did lose my father, my adoptive father, to suicide within months of moving to the United States from Panama. So I was not even 4 years old yet when I lost my father. So starting to work at a mental health organization really felt personal for me. And I was very curious to learn more about mental illness, even though I had not at all landed there on purpose. After a year as a case manager, I was promoted to the ACT team. And what that meant was I carried a beeper. For those of you old enough to remember beepers, I carried a caseload of people who had some of the highest psychiatric hospitalization bed days in the county. And our job as ACT team case managers really was to do whatever it took to keep them out of the hospital. So, I had a beeper. I would get pages from clients at 3 a.m. just needing to talk, helping pick up medication, get to doctor appointments, helping rally their family and their supports if they had them around them, filling out housing applications, whatever it took to keep them as stable as possible was what we did. Shortly after I got that promotion, I learned that I met a grandfathering eligibility in order to be able to obtain my LSW because I did not have a bachelor's in social work. There at that time was, like I said, a grandfathering clause that with a related degree, if you took the test and passed and then took some classes after your licensure within that first year, you could be a licensed social worker. And so I did that, happened upon the information from a coworker. And I'd say working hand in hand with psychiatrists and other case managers and the clients, the people that I was working with in particular, I learned a lot about mental illness in my time there, and that provided really a greater empathy and understanding of my father, who I really have no memory of, but certainly the loss of him was very impactful on my life. So I think that experience provided a lot of insight for me that I don't think I would have had otherwise. But after about 3 years of working in mental health, I just knew that wasn't for me. I'd had somebody jump out of my car when it was moving. I had been spit on. I was making frequent trips to psychiatric hospitals. And then once we even delivered a baby in our office because mom was so in crisis and not lucid enough to go to the hospital that when she realized she was in labor, she came to see her case manager. So that was something I just knew I wasn't cut out for anymore. And I had a coworker at Community Guidance who was leaving because he had just been hired on as the executive director of another agency. I asked him for a job. I mean, I literally said, "Take me with you." And I had no idea what that agency even did. So it turns out it was a private adoption agency that was focused on the recruitment, home study, and educational preparation of Black families specifically. Harambe was not a child placing agency, so they did not have foster parents. I did not come into contact with women or parents in any stage of consideration of adoption. We work specifically with prospective adoptive families doing the, like I said, the home study and the education. So potential adoptive families were then matched with children who more often than not were in the domestic foster care system. So we would reach out to Cuyahoga County, local, statewide, or outside of the state. And then we would do the post-placement supervision and submit those reports. But I also did not have any experience in like adoption finalizations, any of the court stuff while I was at Harambe. What I really began to understand was that many people trying to adopt had no realistic idea of what they were getting into. I can remember that I had one couple, it was an interracial couple, and I was in the home study process with them. They were open to Black children, mixed children, sibling groups. And I was so excited about that for them that children in care are waiting, and it's hard to find families who are willing to take a large sibling group and that sort of thing. And they were open to all of that. And then at one of our sessions, the man told me that they wanted to adopt from Brazil because they didn't want to have to worry about birth parents. And so I really, again, this is where I was able to kind of use my own experience and interject in that educational process. And I just remember talking to them and saying, you know, although I didn't think at that time I would ever know who my birth mother was, she was always a presence in my life. And she was always a figure in our family. Because my whole life I had wondered about her, because my whole life I had asked my mom about her, and my mom would openly talk with me about that. And so, even if there is no contact, no ability to make contact or know who a child's first parents are, you still have to confront and it's still an issue. It's still a thing. And so, um, that always stuck with me. I also um, came across a lot of people who felt that the process was too invasive. Some lied or even omitted significant background information. And I had no problem digging deeper and or recommending denial when I came across those situations when they could not be remediated. Um, and that's something I'll touch on a little bit more. But anyway, at Harambe, I was there for about 1 year. And as Betsy mentioned, it was my supervisor there who had introduced me to Adoption Network Cleveland. And I don't know how many Cleveland folks we have on the call, but my supervisor at Harambe was Mary Pope. If anybody knows how to get in touch with her, hit me up after the call. But Mary is the one who first sent me to Adoption Network Cleveland. And I did go, as Betsy said, as a professional, and then stayed really as an adoptee for that adoptee peer support. So I moved on from Harambe and it went to work at Catholic Social Services. I was in Lake County at that time. And I think honestly that office doesn't exist anymore either. So now that I'm thinking about it, all three of those agencies I've mentioned so far are no longer in existence. I don't know what to make of that. But in any case, so now I'm at Catholic Social Services. I'm still doing home studies and education for prospective adoptive parents, but I'm also now getting to interact with mostly women and young women, on occasion, parents who are at least considering adoption for their child. And I also have to say here, it personally never occurred to me that my birth mother didn't want me. That's not a thought that I ever had. It never occurred to me that she didn't miss me or that if I ever found her that she would reject me. And I know that that is something that is common for adoptees. And I don't think until I started really getting involved in other adoptee groups that I realized that some people have that fear because it just was something that never even occurred to me. And I can say working here and being able to work and talk with parents of babies and children who were considering or had relinquished their child. I saw women from teens to 30s, and they all absolutely would have kept their babies had things in their life been different. I recognize some stark differences in the women that I worked with, particularly when it came to race. What I found was most of the white women had some kind of family and resources. And that's not to say, I mean, I'm certainly not one to speak on whether that family was there supporting them or coercing them. I do not know, but I do know that they almost always had family present and part of the process. But the Black women that I worked with were almost always, in fact, I would say in every case, they were alone and without resources. And that was something that really stood out to me in my time there, were those stark differences. And I know that there's a lot of talk, even historically, about Black children being available for adoption. I use that word. Um, it wasn't the best word, but I used it for lack of another one at the moment. Um, and just the differences in Black and white children being adopted. And I'd really be interested in kind of studying the difference in mothers in Black and white and different races as well who relinquish their children. But that was very informally, non-scientifically of my own observation, what I came to realize in that role. When I was working with parents of babies, I always emphasized what the laws were around being a parent and surrendering. I always said your baby is your baby until you relinquish. You are under no obligation to relinquish. Um, but I did feel like even when they were armed with that information, the pressure from family and or their circumstances usually won out. But I can honestly say that I never met any mother who gave up a child because it was just what she wanted to do. I never ever met any mother who just didn't want to parent. Um, with the prospective families I was working with, there were a lot of conversations around openness. There were degrees of openness. And so I would talk with the moms of babies about what they were comfortable with, what they were looking for. And then ultimately, if that mom picked a family, we would try to work out between the two. They would try to work out between the two. Um, what all of them were comfortable with. But the stark reality of that also is, and what I always told mothers who were placing their children, was that there was no way to enforce those agreements. There was no law, and I think um, today that that's still very true in most states and most jurisdictions, that there is no legal recourse or legal enforcement of adoption agreements as it comes to openness. And it is the adoptive parent who ultimately has the final say on what that will end up looking like. For prospective adoptive families, I also really emphasize normalizing the word adoption and normalizing conversations around adoption with their child, being very open and honest, not waiting for a specific time. My mom did wait. I was born in 1967 and, adopted in Panama where she had no training, no anything. And I also think that at that time, social workers really were still kind of on the end of telling people to just take this baby home and love them like you're your own, and you don't need to worry about it. Um, so my mother waited for a time to tell me when she got kind of that signal from me that I was ready for that conversation. But I have to say, to her credit, and certainly without any prompting or training, she was always open to that conversation with me. Always, whenever I revisited it with her, she would tell me what she knew. And she never made me feel as if um, the conversation was difficult for her. So I really stress that to the families that I worked with. Don't wait for a specific time. If you're taking home a baby who is pre-verbal, you start talking about it day one. It's as normal as spaghetti dinners. You need to say adoption. You need to talk about adoption. You need to work in conversations. Oh, you have beautiful eyes just like your first mother did. I always had those conversations and felt that it was very important. And a lot of that came from my own personal experience. Um, in 1996, I had no idea that the National Association of Black Social Workers had issued a statement asserting the need for Black children to be raised in Black families. But I knew that I believed Black children should be raised in Black families. And children of color should be raised in homes with parents of color as well. As much as possible, and at the very least, serious efforts to find those families for children should be made. Um, when Black moms were placing their children, if we did not have a family with the agency already, I would reach out as far as I could think to agencies where I thought it would be likely that there were more Black families. I often, since I'd graduated from Howard and DC was still at that time the chocolate city, I would reach out to agencies in DC and agencies in Maryland, in the DMV area, because I figured that they probably did have more Black families. So if we had a child who was Black or mixed race and maybe a little harder time matching with a family, I would reach out as far as I could and as to any resources that I could think of. I will say that it was very difficult in that agency one, I was the only Black social worker there. And my coworkers really didn't understand why these things were important to me. I did have a coworker who had a child. She was seeking families for a baby who was of Filipino parentage. And she kept reaching out to families of Puerto Rican descent. And I just didn't understand it. So when I asked her why, she said it was because she thought they were virtually the same. And until we had that conversation, she had no idea that Puerto Rico is an island in the Americas where people descend from indigenous African and European ancestries. The Philippines is an island in Asia on the other side of the world. And she had to go home and ask her husband, who was a social studies teacher, before she believed that that was true. So it was hard. It was hard. As many of us know, oftentimes being the only Black person or the only person of color in a work environment like that, sometimes it's difficult and lonely and hard work. I will say, kind of switching from that topic, in both of the agencies where I worked, Catholic Social Services and Harambe, the fees that they charged were for services. Fees were reasonable and they were often sliding scale for services based on the family's income at both of those agencies. The services that a prospective family is paying for are home studies, legal representation and court filings, and then the post-placement supervision and progress reports that you need to have at your court filing or, at your court hearing for finalization. It never occurred to me that people paid for babies. That was not a concept that I had. I would even say until, well, I would say until recently, I thought that that was quite an anomaly. I did have one family when I was at Catholic Social Services that I had completed the home study. I really liked this family. I thought they were very prepared. I highly recommended them. But after a while, they became very anxious and unsatisfied with the time that it took for a match. And this couple and their parents both went in and refinanced their home so that they could pay over $30,000 to receive a child from another state. And I was shocked and appalled that that was even a thing, because in my short time and in my little bubble of these two agencies, I had no idea. I just had no idea. It certainly is a topic of conversation in adoptee groups and definitely among those who believe in those who are advocating for abolition of adoption. But I have to say that I didn't know, and it wasn't my experience. I stayed at Catholic Social Services for about a year. I threw in this picture just because I think it's adorable. My boys are both grown now. But in about mid to late 97, my youngest was a year old and my oldest had just started kindergarten. I quit working I quit working outside of the home to become a full-time stay-at-home mom. I did a few contract home studies for another agency, not one of the two that I had worked with. And I think talking to Betsy before we got started, I went to Adoption Network. Cleveland was doing training for like adoption assessors to become more adoption competent. And I know that I did that training. I believe that it would have been when I was at home doing contract home studies at that point. Eventually, I did let my LSW lapse. I did a couple of other things. Home daycare for a while was not for me. I became a trainer for a local PBS affiliate, training home daycare workers on the importance of early pre-K childhood education using a Mr. Rogers curriculum. I loved that. And then I worked other jobs that would, like evening call center kind of jobs that would let me be home with my kids during the day. In 2003, we moved to Indiana for my husband's job. And I got a job as a special education teacher assistant in our same school district that we were living so that I could be on the same schedule as my boys. That was in 2003, we moved to Indiana. In 2006, I needed to go to work full time. I thought this will just be temporary. I'm just going to work for a few years, and then I'll be back home with my boys again. And I ended up staying with Indiana's Public Child Welfare Agency for almost 12 years. For that little temporary couple of years thing that I thought I was doing. I still had no idea what I wanted to be when I grow up. I mean, I think maybe you've gotten that from what I've said so far, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. So 2011, I was promoted to adoption manager. In and out of those almost 6 years that I was in that role, I had other responsibilities. I was a grants manager for a period of time. I was over the Youth Connections program for a period of time. I did guardianship for a period of time, but those responsibilities would come and go as they kind of realigned divisions. But I was the adoption manager for the state for almost 6 years. It was 2015 when I'd had enough people who said, why don't you go to school and get your M.S.W, that I finally thought to myself, maybe this is what I want to be when I grow up. 2015, and I started with CGI, community guidance, in 92, I think. So 2015, I'm like, all right, maybe this social work thing really, maybe there's something to it for me. So I did go to grad school and earn my M.S.W. So when I was in this position in Indiana, and I have to shout out Alfreda on the call. She is has always been one of my biggest supporters. I met her in Indiana through this role, and a mentor to me, and she listened to me cry about a lot of things over the years. But in this role, I really stressed to my team and the contractors that our job was not to get every family through to a completed recommended home study. This kind of went back to my Harambe days when I saw people were not always being honest, people didn't want to be forthcoming, that if I can't recommend you, I'm not going to recommend you. And I felt, especially with our contractors, a lot of times they felt that their job was, if somebody came and applied to be a prospective adoptive parent, that their job was to get them to the end of that process. And I said, no, our job is to assess if that family is in fact appropriate and ready to parent an adopted child. And that means with education as well, not that they just have to come with all the answers, but are they receptive to the process and the information that you're giving them? So that was something that I always stressed. If you as the home study writer can't recommend them, don't bring them to our committee to have us recommend them. Like, you were there in their home. And that was really important to me. I stressed that we were not trying to find children for families, but we were there to find families for children. And it was an important distinction that people needed to know who were doing this work. I refuse to allow children's photos on social media or TV spots like Wednesday's Child, which I think had actually been a practice in Indiana some years before. But it was not something I was willing to do. But I will say that what I did realize was that the children that were in need of families were most often teens, sibling groups, and those with significant trauma-based behavior. And people coming to look to adopt, even coming to the foster care system, are looking for babies. And so it's very difficult to reconcile that. And so there has to be some degree of recruitment and awareness. And that's just a hard thing, especially for an adoptee, to have to decide what can we do to address this and still honor the dignity of a child. It was something that I questioned quite a bit. I refused in this role to use terms like forever families, because the fact of the matter is the children in foster care know that that's not true. It is often a lie. And unfortunately, in this role, I heard people say things that just turned my stomach. I had a man who called one time. He wanted his adopted child out of the home. And as I talked to him about post-adoption services and trying to get some supports in, he said, I guess I would try harder if he was my own seed, but he's not, and I want him out of my house. I would hear of things like people who would learn of a sibling group in care, and they would call and ask if they could have just one child. Foster parents who had a sibling group placed with them, but only wanted one removed or one to stay. And then there were workers who often allowed their own biases to dictate how they worked their case. I know that that's not everything that was going on. I know that there were a lot of successful stories out there, but I think in my position, particularly being over the post-adopt contracts and things, the things that elevated to me were the worst case scenarios. And that got really difficult too. Uh-oh, I did something on my own screen. Here we go. So some conclusions. I don't know how we're doing on time, Betsy. Based on what I saw, learned, and came to believe. One is that adoption is built on a foundation of loss. Everybody has lost something. Everybody certainly within the triad, but I would even say within the constellation of adoption, everybody has lost something. And my mom, my adoptive mom, has passed just a little over a year ago. But in those last couple of years, we were living together, and a lot of road trips and things, I would listen to adoptee podcasts. And I remember my mom asking me one time, like, where are the happy stories in these adoptee podcasts? And you know, all I could say was, if there were a happy story, people wouldn't need to be adopted, right? And I mentioned to her, adoptee is built on a foundation of loss. Everybody has lost something. And she asked me, what had she lost? What had she lost by adopting me? And I told her she lost the dreams of having a girl who would grow up to be what she had always dreamed of, a girl who would grow up to be just like her. Because as much as the two of us loved one another, we were oil and water. We were not the same. She didn't understand many things about me. My love for animals, she was afraid of everything. Everything. But there are, you know, when people adopt, you have to let go of certain ideals and dreams that you may have had creating a family a different way. And honestly, I believe from what I have seen is that the fact is most people adopt for their own wants and desires. People come in with, I want a baby, I want to be a parent, I want a girl, I want a big family. They come in for a lot of reasons that have to do with what they want. And if we could get people to really, all people, right, to deal with our own losses and issues and trauma and resolve these things, if we could approach adoption as truly child-centered and adopt because of what the child needs, I think things would look very different. When prospective foster and adoptive families were in training about trauma and behaviors, all these different trainings that I was doing at the time, and they were hearing about what behaviors could manifest, what identity issues the child may go through over the years. I really began to observe that they just were not hearing it. And I think I've probably said this to Alfreda. I may have said it to Betsy at some time. How do we get to a point where we're training people and they're hearing the information? And I didn't really see that happen for the majority. I think that oftentimes people are very excited about the decision that they've made and the journey that they're about to embark on, and they just don't hear it. Or they dismiss it, believing that it won't apply to them because they're just going to love this child and that will take care of all of it. When you approach something in that way, the child's needs are always going to be secondary. And for those who are willing to learn and grow, realizing the child's needs is often going to be painful then. And because it comes later. And speaking of trauma, I also had a grandmother one time tell me that her grandson had no trauma because he had been with her since he left the hospital after birth. Like, I'm all he's ever known. I picked up this child right from the hospital. He came to my house. What trauma? This was a little boy who spent his time in utero ingesting the drugs that his mother took. He was separated from her immediately after birth, and he was kept in an incubator, meaning probes and wires and IVs, kept in an incubator in NICU for quite a long while after he was born. And when I laid that all out to her, I'm like, all he had was trauma before you picked him up from the hospital. And I think that people don't always realize that. And just that trauma of relinquishment, which is also a very big topic, and I feel growing more in the attention that it's getting. Just the trauma of relinquishment without drug exposure and NICU time and all of these things. It is a trauma that every child separated from their parent experiences. And I really have to ask that we stop changing names of children who are old enough to know their name. And even for children who are not old enough to know their name, at the very least, incorporate it, acknowledge it, honor it. But stop changing names of children who know their names. Yeah, I'm not going to go into specific cases about that. So on the other side of my slide, I really have, well, first, and I think I may have said this earlier, I am not one who believes that we can abolish adoption. I I think it would be wonderful. I think in some perfect world, it would be great if adoption could be abolished. But I just don't think that it's reality. I don't think it'll be reality in my lifetime, or probably the lifetime of anybody on this call. I just think that there are too many societal things that would have to be addressed before we could do away with adoption. I do think that there are some things that could be changed immediately. There are some things that people are working for right now. Um, I have on the slide true and transparent informed consent for first parents. I know I'm not going to try and butcher her name, but Kelsey, birth mom of the book Adoption Unfiltered, is a big advocate, and she works on presenting things to take to legislation for that. But it's needed, right? All of those truths that we have to tell people when they come, and tell it in a way that is, this is the reality of what you are doing, and not influence the decision. Because we're not in, it should not be a business. And so when you tell a person what the choices are and what the consequences of those choices and the long-term outcomes are, they should be able to make a decision for themselves based on that honest information. Family preservation is definitely something that we could be doing better. I think most systems now tout family preservation. I'm not sure that they are really putting their money and efforts behind that. Or as a society that we're really putting our money or mouths and efforts behind that. But true family preservation, I think we have to stop altering and hiding records. We have to stop altering and hiding records. In the foster care system, I think, and these were workers when I was still in Indiana who were on my team, who brought up ideas like maybe if foster families could be there for not only the child, but the parent or parents, right? Like take them in as a unit, provide care and mentoring to that parent or parents until they're able to be in a position to take care of the child on their own, and or they have gained the skills that they need to take care of the child on their own. But we could revamp the system to do that instead of pitting resource parents, foster and prospective parents against first parents. And I feel like the system still does that, even when it touts that it's doing something different. And honestly, agencies have to show true discretion in who is, can be, or should remain a foster or prospective or adoptive parent. We have to show discretion. There has to be more discretion in that. So that really is the end. I've got that statement there on this slide at the bottom. That was something I started saying when I was in Indiana in that role as adoption manager, and I have said it in every role that I've been in since. Even if removal is the thing that saves a child's life, we have to understand that we are doing harm by removing them. Even with all of our best intentions, we have to acknowledge that we are creating more trauma. We're doing harm, even when it's the right thing to do. So that's all that I have on that very heavy note that I just ended on. I am free to open for questions and comments, or however Julius and Betsy want this to go next.
Great. I have a couple for you. So thank you so much, Sandy. A lot of information, and I learned, even though I've known you for so long, I learned a lot. So a couple things. One is that there's somebody on the call whose sister-in-law is Mary Pope. And so she was texting or messaging Mary while you were talking, and she can connect you. So, so
Please
I'll make sure the two of you
do.
connect after. Yeah.
That's
So that's exciting.
awesome. I would love to connect with her and thank her and all the things.
She's
Hi,
married to
Sai.
Mary's oldest brother, so it's a small world, right?
It is a small world.
And there's also somebody on the call who you went to high school with, who asked a question. She's an adoptee and searched actually through Adoption Network Cleveland several years ago for her birth mother. And her birth mother denied her, was not interested in forming a relationship. And so she's asking if you ever felt abandonment issues. I know you touched on that, but that was more, I think, before your reunion, so I don't know if that's something you want to
Yeah,
talk about.
um, for sure. And I think because there's only one person on here that I'm recognizing that I went to high school with, but I'm not going to call that person out. Um, I definitely abandonment issues. I think I have been kind of joking about abandonment issues before I even really understood how much I've been impacted by them. Um, but for sure, but also I will say in my case, I think that my abandonment issues were very much compounded by what happened once I was in my adoptive family. I mentioned that my father died by suicide. Um, my brother, who was much older than me and was my father's biological child, but not my mother's, he left the home when our father died. Um, and then other things happened in my life where I felt abandoned by everybody. I felt abandoned by everybody. And I think, when I talked about working at community guidance and mental health, really coming to a better understanding about what my father may have been dealing with. But I can remember in high school, in particular, writing a paper one time about how angry I was at my father, that he would bring me from another country, give me his last name, and then leave me like that. Um, so yeah, definitely abandonment issues. I mean, my story's a little different as far as my birth mother is concerned. And as Betsy said, she didn't have a say in losing her child. And so um, there hasn't been that kind of rejection. But for sure, for sure, abandonment issues. I will even say I can remember having a conversation with my cousin when I was a kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and somehow the topic of me being adopted came up. We were talking, and I think in her effort to make me feel better, I don't know, make the conversation less heavy, she said to me, well, at least you were chosen. And I remember even at that age, my response to her was, but I had to have been given up first. So for sure, abandonment issues, yeah, all my life.
And not to put you on the spot, but since you said, you're open to questions, I wonder, so I don't know, if you want to share like what happened, how you ended up being placed for adoption, but even though it wasn't your birth mother, there was a major betrayal in your birth family and somebody took that action, right? Do you want
Yeah,
to talk about that, or is that?
sure. No, I don't mind at all. Um, so my birth mother was 14 when she had me. She was living with her godmother. Um, she had me at the hospital. She came home to her godmother's house with me. Um, her intention always was to parent me, but somewhere in the months that followed, her godmother passed away and she had to return home to her mother's. She had to return to her mother's home. Her mother had, my grandmother, my abuela, had, I don't know, remarried legally, but she had another man, another husband in the house, a stepfather to my birth mother. And that didn't they were not getting along. I think that he had issues with all of my abuela's children, from her previous relationship. Anyway, I am now in the home of my abuela, and they sent my birth mother away. I always believed it was something like maybe a boarding school situation, but I think in my more recent trips, I've come to understand it that they probably sent her away to like a juvenile detention kind of a place. And while she was there, my grandmother contacted an attorney and started making the arrangements for me to be adopted. I asked my grandmother, like, how did they, or my birth mother, how did they do this without your signature on things? And she says she remembers somebody coming to the place where she was, clipboard in hand, flipping to the end of a paper and saying, sign here, but never being told what she was signing. So yeah. And then when she came home, so 15, she got married so that she could sign herself out of this place. She came back to her mother's house to get her child, and I wasn't there. And the only thing her mother said was, and they never spoke of it again until 30 some years later when I found my first mom.
Oh,
Yeah,
quite a story.
yeah, it was heartbreaking. And I think that my first mom's life has bared witness to that loss. She never recovered.
Sure. I'm gonna put a few links in the chat. It's been a heavy evening together, and we have lots of support available. We also have a search program. I just put that in. We do have, through Adoption Network, meetings for adult adoptees, birth family members, adoptive family members. They're open to everyone. Those are called general discussion meetings. We also have a DNA support group, a DNA discovery support group, and a birth mother support group. So I'm putting the link of where you can find those, so that people are supported. So we have one person raising their hand. We're getting a little tight on time. Actually, I think it's actually 9 o'clock, but Kelly, if you can ask a question real quick, and then we'll end right after that.
Hi, Sandy. Great talk. Hey, one thing I'm always curious about in the current adoption environment and space is how often are people who are looking to adopt people who are adopting children who are in the foster care system for whom there's no feasible plan for them for these kids to return to their first
Mhm.
families whose parents basically have lost their parental rights or whose parental rights have been terminated. How many would you say of like these people who are looking to adopt these kids are weighing the option of permanent legal guardianship versus adoption so that the child can retain their OBC and not have it replaced or amended? And I guess I could talk to you more about this sometime, but I'm just wondering, like, legally, does that keep the child still allowed to maintain their original identity, even though they have this separate permanent legal guardian if the parents go that route? Thank you.
Yeah. And I know that I do hear that a lot in adoptee spaces as well, that guardianship would be a better alternative. That's something that I really have had to kind of wrap my brain around in more recent years. I would say, to answer your question directly, I don't think that it's considered very often. When you have somebody coming forward for legal guardianship, it is usually a family member who wants to preserve that relationship and do it for other reasons, right? But again, I think most often, and certainly not always, but most often when people are coming to adopt, that's what they want to do, is adopt. And they're very kind of single-minded on that. But I also have to say that, you know, it's one thing for people who, for adoptees who were given up at birth voluntarily, right? Because we know that not every voluntary situation was voluntary. But as opposed to kiddos who are coming into the system and recognizing disproportionality and all the things that are wrong with the system, right? Setting that aside just for the sake of this conversation, there are kids who experienced unspeakable things, right? And so then the topic becomes, if you, and I'm not having this conversation with a child, right? But the situation that you have to think about is if they are not adopted and something awful happens, who do they have now at 19 and 20 and 21? And yes, a lot of that can be addressed through informal kinds of relationships. You know, but if I'm a child who was severely abused, neglected, and this is a generational thing in my family, and there were no other family options, and I end up in the hospital at 19 years old, do I want that original parent coming back being the one who's making decisions for me? Guardianship ends at 18. Guardianship ends at 18. I think that in the cases where adoption is necessary, we can also honor that child's original identity. That would be the right way to do it. That adoption doesn't have to mean that, you know, we need to be able to do adoption different, but there are places where it's going to be, I think, needed. I don't think that all the adoptions happening today fall in that category, but I think that there will always be some. And guardianship ends at 18, and now I've got nobody.
Yeah, in the situation that you know, gave, that child would have really no, you know, no family, you know, no legal family. I mean, they'd still be legal family with the people that abuse them, but that, you know, might or might not meet any of their needs as an adult. So we should have like a Monday evening just about this, because this is a big topic, and so we're over time, and I don't feel like we can really fully do it justice.
Thank you for the question, though, Kelly. I really, like I said, it's something I've been thinking about more, because I know that a lot of people bring it up as an option. And I think in some cases it might be, but I don't think in all. And I'm sorry, Betsy, I didn't mean to revisit that. If I can say real quickly, I see so many faces of people that I know and I appreciate coming out and supporting me. I feel very supported in that way. So I appreciate all of you.
Well, thank you so much, Sandy. If you'll stay on for a minute after we end, there's a lot of nice notes for you in chat, so I want to make sure you get a chance to see them, since I didn't get to speak them out loud. But just to let people know, we do have an exciting lineup this fall. We've got lots of presentations coming up. The next one is October 7th, so it's in 2 weeks. and that's Lauren Laguidis. I don't know if that's a correct way to say her name. I'll find out between now and then. She's a comedian in New York City. She's a donor conceived person, and she's going to be talking about bringing lightness to the tough stuff. So maybe the flip side of some of the notes that we're ending on this evening. Thank you to Sandi for volunteering her time, and to everybody that joined us this evening. Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization. We're membership based. So if you're interested in maybe joining, you can check out our website. As I mentioned earlier in the program, it is our anniversary. So it'd be a great day to join. It's our 36th anniversary. And I think I put plenty of links in the chat. I did put just a minute ago survey that you can fill out to let us know what you thought about this program. There's also room on that survey if you've got program suggestions or additional people that you'd like to hear from. So let us know. So thank you so much for coming.